Hey guys, it's Vadim with Aztec and welcome to the Ultimate Mac Studio comparison. And when I say ultimate, I mean it because for the past week, we've been putting all three of these Mac Studio models to the test and we found some groundbreaking bombshell information in terms of diminishing returns and which one of these you should be buying. So without further ado, I want to mention which specs each one of these has. And in terms of the specs, the base model has the M1 Max with the binned 24-core GPU and 32 gigabytes of unified memory. Then the middle model has the M1 Ultra with the binned 48-core GPU with 64 gigs of unified memory, so double the memory. And then the final model has double the memory again, 128 gigs with the full unlocked 64-core GPU. And by the end of this ultimate comparison, you are gonna know exactly which one of these models you should be buying based on your specific use case. So before we actually get into the benchmarks, I want to talk about a couple of the differences. First of all, both of the M1 Ultra models have two Thunderbolt ports in the front compared to just USB Type-C on the base M1 Max model. And the other difference is that the M1 Ultras actually have a really beefy fully copper double-sided cooling system, as we showed you guys in our full teardown video, compared to the M1 Max that has a much more traditional cooling system, no longer double-sided, but it is still pretty impressive. But other than that, they're basically all identical with no other design or spec or port differences. And with that said, let's jump right into performance, starting off with Geekbench 5's single-core test, where they're all performing basically the same. And the reason for that is because they all have the same cores. The M1 Ultra just doubles the amount of CPU cores, but they're still the same cores, so that's why there's no difference in single core performance. And that actually translates to basically the same performance in terms of web browsing with the Speedometer 2.0 test. So in terms of snappiness for common tasks like web browsing or opening apps, other stuff like that, they should all be the same. So no difference going from the 2K up to the crazy fully loaded 8K model. But now let's move over to the multi-core test. And of course, since the M1 Ultras have basically double the cores, they're getting almost perfect scaling for double the multi-core performance. It's just lacking by a little bit, but it's still a very impressive score. And then when we move over to a more realistic benchmark that puts in 100% CPU workload, like Cinebench R23, we actually see almost the same results, almost 2 times perfect scaling, which is actually very impressive. But we dug deep into acetop and the actual watts that are used between the M1 Max and the M1 Ultras, and we noticed that Apple is allowing the M1 Ultras to push more wattage towards the M1 Ultra chips in order to maintain that almost 2 times perfect scaling. Because the peak wattage we saw in Cinebench with the M1 Max was actually 27.66 watts, but going over to the M1 Ultra, it was actually over double the wattage, up to 58 watts. So Apple is actually giving more power to the Ultras to try to maintain that scaling. But the very interesting thing is that Cinebench is actually not utilizing these chips very well, because I tested the peak wattage in a different app and it was actually quite a bit higher. For example, I ran a Lightroom photo export and I was able to get these M1 Ultra chips to go up to 68 watts of peak usage. Yes, 68, and I got the M1 Max in the base model up to 32 watts of power usage. So once again, this proves that Apple is willing to pump extra wattage into the M1 Ultra chips to maintain the scaling, which is a very, very good sign. And in terms of the performance in that Lightroom photo export, both of the M1 Ultras finished in 45 seconds compared to 1 minute and 22 seconds for the M1 Max model, and that is actually 82% faster. So these M1 Ultras 82% faster than the base M1 Max, which is not perfect scaling because there are a lot of other factors included in that test, but it's still very impressive, and it's an extremely fast score compared to older computers. But with that said, for this ultimate comparison, we wanted to add in a couple more photo editing tests. So we did an absolutely insane panorama where we took 16 50 megapixel photos and then had Lightroom Classic create a panorama. And interestingly, in here, the M1 Ultra models were only 48% faster, so you're really getting some diminishing returns once it's processing the panoramas, which is very interesting. So we decided to also test Photoshop and basically do the same auto merge panorama, and I think Photoshop actually does a better job at combining it and getting rid of distortion. However, the M1 Ultra models this time around were only 20% faster. So I don't know if there's some weird optimization issues, but like, if you're looking at that test, the M1 Max is doing a killer job considering the price. And now with photo editing out of the way, let's move over to programming within Xcode. And of course, we are using our Xcode benchmark that Maxim Eremenko made for us. And in this test, we got some very interesting results. First of all, going from the base machine to the best M1 Ultra with 128 gigs of unified memory only gave us a boost of 35%. So 35% faster for this machine, which honestly isn't that impressive. And it was only 3 seconds faster than the mid-range machine that has 64 gigs of unified memory. So literally having double the memory saved us 3 seconds on that Xcode benchmark. So it kind of looks like the memory is not really being used that well, at least for this Xcode benchmark. So it looks like Apple Silicon's doing a great job, but only 35% from here to here. However, moving on to music production using Logic Pro, we actually saw some really good scaling. The M1 Max model was able to handle 173 tracks before the CPU overloaded, but then going over to the best of the best M1 Ultra with 128 gigs, it handled 341 tracks, which is absolutely insane. That's 97% more tracks than the M1 Max. And interestingly, this is actually the test where we saw a difference with the unified memory, because the 128 gig model was able to handle 26 extra tracks solely because of the doubling in unified memory. But to be completely honest, over 300 tracks is overkill for basically almost anybody, and even 173 on the M1 Max is probably good enough for most people in Logic. So these are all very impressive. And now with some of the CPU-based stuff out of the way, let's pivot over to the graphics, starting with Geekbench 5's metal test. And here you can see some significant diminishing returns going from the M1 Max to the M1 Ultra with a 48 core and then the 64 core. And I do want to explain the underwhelming results. That's because Geekbench has really fast, short burst kind of things that it does, so it never ramps up the GPU wattage high enough, so it's not really reliable. So we're gonna switch over to GFXBench benchmark with the 1440p Aztec Ruins off-screen test. And this is where things get very disappointing, because going from the 24 core binned M1 Max to the 48 core binned M1 Ultra, so that's double the GPU cores, we're only getting 72% higher performance. And then going up to the 64 core, it's even worse. Only 17% faster. Now that is extremely disappointing, because this model, just for unlocking the 64 core GPU, it costs $1,000. That's before changing the unified memory or the storage or anything. Literally $1,000 to go from 48 to 64, and we're getting 17% higher performance, which is just so disappointing. So with that said, we decided to test 3D Mark's Wildlife Extreme benchmark, which we think is more optimized, and we basically saw the same disappointing results. Going from the 24 core M1 Max to the 64 core M1 Ultra was only 2.24 times faster, which is definitely disappointing. So what we decided to do was break it down in terms of score, per GPU core. And here you can see that the highest end M1 Ultra is really underwhelming, and it's just not being utilized that well at all, with the best bang for the buck actually going to the 24-core M1 Max. So we started to search for an answer to why this is happening, why we are getting such bad diminishing returns, and we actually found it by measuring the peak wattage with all three of these different machines during Wildlife Extreme Unlimited. The 24-core M1 Max hit 34.98 watts peak, while the 48-core doubled M1 Ultra hit 68.26, so that's almost double the amount of power. However, going up to the 64-core, we only saw 86.14 watts, which seems extremely low because Apple showed off over 100 watts of power usage going to the GPU, but that is not what we're seeing here at all, only 86. So going even further, we decided to break down how much watts each chip is giving each GPU. So essentially the wattage per GPU core. And as you can see, as you go higher in terms of the amount of cores, they're giving it less watts per core. So this is actually a major contrast to the CPU, because Apple was pumping in extra watts into the CPUs to try to get double the scaling. But with the GPUs, they're actually doing the opposite. The more GPU cores you have, they're reducing the total wattage, which is very disappointing. So that makes me wonder, what if there's some sort of power limit or flaw on the GPU side while not on the CPU side? And I'm gonna answer that in just a couple of minutes. But before I get into that crazy video editing torture test that we ran to prove it, I wanna give a shout out to our new premium M1 Ultra design hoodie. Yes, this thing looks really good. It's ultra soft, ultra premium, and it shows off the M1 Ultra chip. It's our own custom design. So if you want to show your support for all this crazy work that we've been doing and testing, please use the promo code M1 Ultra for 20% off on all of our merch that you can find in our merch shelf below. Now, before I get into Blender 3D video rendering, I do want to get into the Affinity photo benchmark. And here, this was actually very interesting because we got almost perfect 99% scaling in terms of the CPU benchmark performance going from the M1 Max to both of the Ultra. So that's a very good sign. But once again, looking at the GPU scaling, it is absolutely horrible. Going from the 24-core M1 Max to the 48-core M1 Ultra, we only got 56% better performance, which sucks because it should be double if it was properly scaled. And this is Affinity Photo, which is actually very well optimized with metal. But going from 48 cores to 64, we literally only got 6% better performance, which is just so odd and just so disappointing. And unfortunately, these results also transferred over into Blender 3D rendering. We tested the Party Tug example project render, and here the 64-core was only 13% faster than the 48-core. Once again, crazy diminishing returns, but thankfully, comparing the 24-core M1 Max to the 48-core M1 Ultra, it was actually 91% faster, which is by far the best scaling we've seen. So it must be something in terms of the unified memory with the 64 gigs of RAM that is really helping out the GPU rendering compared to the M1 Max that's limited to 32 gigs. So with that said, we also ran the Classroom GPU render with the Cycles engine, but here it was no longer 91, it was actually 70% faster going from the M1 Max to the M1 Ultra with 48 cores, but unfortunately, it was even worse for the 64-core, only 11% faster compared to the 48-core, so even worse diminishing returns right there. And then as for the last test in Blender, I actually decided to run Classroom, but with the CPU instead of the GPU, just to test out the scaling for CPU rendering, and here, it was actually pretty impressive. Going from the 10-core M1 Max to the 20-core M1 Ultra, we got 95% faster performance, so almost 2x scaling, which is really nice. But the interesting part with this test is that this model with the extra RAM, 128 gigs compared to 64, was even faster. Yes, this M1 Ultra was 18% faster, and the only difference was the unified memory, the doubling in the RAM. So I guess Blender is really able to use the RAM, and it does speed up performance, so that's nice, but you gotta think, is the extra $1,000 worth the 18%? Well, if you have very large projects, then maybe it is, but you make that decision for yourself. And now finally, let's get into video editing, where we found some bombshell differences in terms of the diminishing returns between these three. But before I begin, I do want to mention that Max is going to be doing a dedicated video editing video testing multiple apps, Final Cut, DaVinci Resolve, Premiere Pro, comparing the differences between all of these, getting into export times, into playback and timeline performance, all that stuff. So if you're interested, definitely click subscribe so you do not miss out on that. But for this video, I'm gonna keep it to the things that you really need to know about. And the first test that we ran is our basic general 5-minute 4K H.264 export, and yes, that is graded with 2 LUTs and film grain applied. This is basically the most common codec that a lot of people are using. In fact, we are still using it to shoot and export and edit ourselves. And here, you'll be surprised to hear that they all scored exactly the same time, 1 minute and 52 seconds. And I think the reason for it is because Final Cut has not been upgraded or updated yet. Even though these Mac Studios came out, we're still on the old version, and Apple has not given us a new one, so literally no difference. And that basically means that the doubled media engines, or the doubled encoders and decoders, are not being utilized at all, which is extremely disappointing right now. And just to make sure that's the case, we actually did the same export within DaVinci Resolve, and here we actually got faster performance compared to Final Cut. We finished in around 1 minute and 40 seconds, once again across all 3 of these machines. So DaVinci Resolve is also not updated yet to support the doubled media engines. But the big point that I do want to mention is that during these exports, we measured the GPU usage to see how much of an overhead you have, just in case you want to throw on a ton of extra graphics, lens flares, whatever else. And surprisingly, the M1 Max was only using 53% of the GPU, so you still have a bunch of GPU overhead even with the 24-core GPU. And going to the craziest 64-core, it was only using 35%, and I'd actually expect a bigger difference, but it's using 35 compared to 53, so basically there's really no point, right now at least, to go for the Ultras if you're just doing basic H.264 exports. And now over the last couple of years, we actually got a new standard that was introduced, and that's HEVC, or H.265, and that is actually more efficient because you get a much smaller file size, you get better quality as well, and as you'll see right now, you actually get faster export speeds. So we tested it in Final Cut, and that time came down to 1 minute and 17 seconds for both M1 Ultras, and actually 1 minute 23 for the M1 Max. So for some reason, it's a little bit slower. And the reason for that is because the 24-core is just ever so slightly bottlenecking it, so it's 5 seconds slower because it doesn't have enough GPU power due to only having the 24 cores compared to the 48 and 64. But with that said, we actually threw the same export test into DaVinci Resolve, and our times came down to around 49 seconds each. Yes, only 49 seconds for this 5-minute export. Keep in mind, it's graded with 2 LUTs and film grain. That is very impressive. So DaVinci Resolve is currently being better than Final Cut. And we actually ended up looking at the GPU usage, and even the M1 Max was using 79% of the GPU, so it's almost perfectly balanced. It still has a little bit of wiggle room, 21% of GPU overhead if you want to add a little bit more, but if you add a lot more, you are going to be throttled compared to these other machines where the mid machine was at 65% GPU usage and 52% GPU usage on the 64 core. So there are some diminishing returns there, and you have a lot of extra headroom if you want to throw in a lot of extra graphics and things like that. But once again, I do want to mention that due to those results, around 49 seconds each, these M1 Ultras are definitely being throttled by the encoders. So they're just hitting the limit and the extra encoders are not being used at all. So let's pivot over to something that is purely GPU based. Yes, this is 8K Red Raw, so it cannot take advantage of any encoders, any decoders. It's purely based on the GPU. And here we actually saw a similar story in terms of diminishing returns. Going from the 24 core M1 Max to the 48 core M1 Ultra, only 37.5% faster. So doubling the GPU cores, only 37.5%. So very diminishing returns there. But then going from the 48 core to the 64, we actually got 23% faster. So only 5 minutes and 25 compared to 6 minutes and 40. And that right there could actually be a big deal for you guys doing 8K Red Raw or whatever else Red Raw you're doing, 23% faster for $1,000. That could actually be worth it for a lot of people, especially since this is actually only a 5-minute Red Raw export. Imagine if you have an hour-long project. Like, you're gonna save a lot of time going from the 48 to the 64, so this could actually be worth it. But then that wasn't enough for us. We wanted to do something crazy, so we did a torture test. Yes, we exported Canon RAW, that's 8K RAW to 4K HEVC. That is our torture test because it basically maxes out the CPU and the GPU at the same time. And here is where we saw by far the most disappointing results out of this entire video. Going from the $2,000 base model to the $4,000 bin 48 core GPU only gave us 25% faster export times. So that's extreme diminishing returns right there. But making things even worse, going from this mid machine to the 64 core with literally double the unified memory, only 4% faster. That is absolutely terrible, maxing out both the CPU and the GPU, and to us, this made absolutely zero sense until we dug into the peak wattage and the GPU frequencies, where it just got so disappointing. Apparently, in this test, all 3 of the GPUs were throttled. Yes, the peak should be 1300 megahertz, but the M1 Max clocked down to 1255 megahertz. But the mid-range M1 Ultra clocked down to 912 megahertz. Yes, it is throttling it for some reason. And the 64 core GPU model clocked down to 752 megahertz. It is getting extremely slowed down. And to our surprise, we looked at the wattage that was being used for the GPU, and the M1 Max with 24 cores for the GPU was actually using more wattage than the fully loaded 64 core GPU, 25.1 compared to 22.5, with the mid-range using the most wattage towards the GPU, which is absolutely mind-blowing, and it just makes no sense at all. So with that said, I've got to answer the question of why the M1 Ultras are getting downclocked severely and why the wattage is getting downclocked so badly. And in my opinion, I think there's some sort of power limit or M1 Max die design flaw that is not allowing Apple to push both the CPU and the GPU to the max. So they're basically prioritizing the CPU, but they're cutting back on the GPU in terms of the wattage and the frequencies. And you might be thinking, well, maybe it's thermal throttling. Maybe they're overheating. Well, it's not. It's absolutely not at all. We measured the CPU and GPU temperatures at the end of this crazy Canon export, and the 64-core GPU in the M1 Ultra was only 57 degrees Celsius, and the CPU was only 68 degrees Celsius, with the other two being around the same. That is extremely cool because Apple used to be able to go up to 100 degrees Celsius on both the CPU, GPU, no problem. That's usually their limit. But here you can see that there's a massive amount of thermal headroom. So it is not thermal throttling at all. It is something different. And I think for some reason, they just can't supply enough power into both the CPU and the GPU at the same time, so they gotta downclock the GPU. And let me remind you guys that this is literally the craziest torture test possible because it's set to max out both the CPU and GPU at the same time, but because of this weird internal die power limit, it just drops it down and it's not able to supply all the power and it's not able to fire up all the GPU cores at maximum performance. And this is really unfortunate because Apple threw in this crazy copper heatsink with the double-sided cooling, and it is just not able to ever utilize it and actually make use of that cooler. And the craziest thing is that when we initially tore down these models and we compared the M1 Max heatsink to the crazy copper double-sided heatsink on the M1 Ultra, we thought that these machines would be running cooler, they would be able to supply more power, they'd be able to run quieter with the fan speeds, but no, absolutely not. The M1 Max model only ran slightly hotter. So literally, these crazy cooling systems are not being used. It's almost like Apple had this huge disconnect between their design team, their cooling team, and their actual chip team, where the chip team was saying like, hey, we need double of everything for the M1 Max. It's got to supply and cool down this crazy amount of power. So they went all out. They got the copper, they got this thick heatsink with the crazy fans, but there was a disconnect because for some reason, they could not supply the full amount of power to those GPU cores, so there is severe diminishing returns when both the CPU and GPU are used at the same time. And you're probably thinking, well, maybe there's a fan noise difference. Maybe these ones are able to run more silently. Well, no, because throughout all this testing, every single test we ran, I never heard the fans go above idle. Literally, your AC noise or whatever ambient noise overpowers the idle fans. You can't even hear them, no matter what test we ran, completely silent across all three of these machines. And that's even when we ran Cinebench and Wildlife Extreme at the same time. And that's even when I did my ultimate gaming test. I literally couldn't hear the fans and the chips were cool the entire time. So these cooling systems are completely overkill. So hopefully it's meant to be future-proofed for the M2 Ultra in the future so it can supply more power. Maybe if Apple fixes that weird design flaw within the Max dies and they could actually supply the actual amount of power that we need. But for now, like, they could have made these Mac Studios a lot smaller and it would be just fine, but they just went all out. But anyway, with all of that said, let me get into my final conclusions. If you just need common web browsing and common app performance like that, the M1 Max base model for $2,000 is obviously the best choice, and it actually has by far the best bang for the buck, seeing as we're getting so much diminishing returns with these M1 Ultra machines. Now, if you mainly just care about CPU performance, maybe for photo editing, Lightroom Classic exporting, Affinity Photo, or 3D rendering using the CPU, I'd say that going up to the M1 Ultra is actually worth it because you're getting a lot of extra performance for the extra cash. But I'd say the 128 gig model, I don't think I would recommend that to anybody because you're really getting diminishing returns in terms of that RAM, at least for CPU performance benchmarks and tests. So with that said, most people just need to stick to 64 gigs of unified memory, do not get the 128. So for CPU performance, yes, the M1 Ultra is worth it, but now let's get into the GPU. If you're doing Blender, 3D rendering with the GPU, I'd say that going for the M1 Ultra with 48 cores is definitely worth it, but paying $1,000 for 11 or 13% faster performance for the 64 core, I don't think that's worth it at all for Blender because you're just paying so much money for such a small improvement in Blender. And then finally getting into video editing, this is by far not worth it at all. It's just extreme diminishing returns. It's not really able to take advantage of the 64 core GPU. So video editors out there, you should probably stick to the 48 core, only 64 gigs of unified memory, do not get 128. Now the only test out of all those video editing tests where I think it might be worth going for the crazy 64 core is of course the 8K Red, where we got 23% faster performance. And once again, you've got to spend $1,000 to get 23% faster in 8K Red. So that's your choice on whether you think it's worth it or not. But to be completely honest, if you're a video editor and you care about bang for the buck, this thing right here for $2,000 is by far the best deal because right now, the M1 Ultras are not utilizing the extra media engines at all whatsoever, and you're not even getting that good of performance improvements paying double the money. So for video editors, this thing's actually killer, and I definitely recommend this as the best bang for the buck option. But if you want to spend more money to squeeze out a little bit more performance, especially if Final Cut gets updated to support the media engines, then I'd say just stick to the $4,000 model here. Just do not get the 64 core. I honestly don't think anybody should be going for the 64 core or the 128 gigs of unified memory unless you know you want to squeeze out just the tiniest bit of performance and you're willing to spend the extra cash. And with that said, that was a lot of stuff that we tested, so hopefully you enjoy the video, and if you appreciate all the work we did, please subscribe for more videos like this one because we have some more content coming up. Definitely check out one of those two videos right there. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.